Haven Station was alive with sound and color, as ships of every design came and went under the watch of towering docking arms and glittering advertisement boards that threw dancing lights on the endless crowd of travelers, merchants, and wanderers who moved with purpose or curiosity through the open bazaar. At its heart were rows of stalls, displayed goods that smelled of spices from forgotten moons or shimmered with alien alloys from the farthest reaches of the known galaxy. And in that swirl of languages and faces, one human trader named Eli found himself searching for a particular item that was said to be rarer than clean air on a mining colony, the quantum crystal that could power a jump drive across sectors in half the time of any normal vessel. And he moved between the stalls with his mind on the deal. He hoped to make, knowing that every moment wasted brought the risk of another trader snatching the prize away. He had learned long ago that the key to winning in markets like this was not just credits, but charm and the ability to read someone's posture or eyes to sense greed, hesitation, or pride. And that skill had kept him alive and thriving in places where a wrong word could end more than a business deal. So, when he saw her across the crowd standing in front of a display of strange star metal necklaces that caught the light in a way that felt almost alive, he felt that familiar pull of curiosity, not only for the item she was holding, but for the figure herself, tall and poised, with skin that shifted in hue like liquid pearl, and eyes that seemed to hold the shimmer of a distant nebula. She was unlike anyone else in the bazaar, and yet she stood there as if the noise and chaos did not touch her at all. Eli stepped closer, weaving past a pair of bulky freighter crew who smelled strongly of engine oil and burnt ozone, and as he came to stand near her, he realized that the item in her hand was not for sale at all, but part of her own attire. A chain of those star metal loops wrapped loosely around her wrist, and the way she touched it was almost absent-minded, as if her thoughts were far from the market and somewhere deep in her own world. He thought for a moment about walking away, because she did not look like a seller, and this did not seem like the right time for business. But then she turned slightly, and he saw the curve of her lips, full and soft with a faint shimmer like the edge of dawn over calm water, and the words left his mouth before he could stop them. Beautiful lips. She looked at him slowly, her gaze traveling from his boots to his eyes, as if weighing something unseen. And then her mouth curved into a smile that seemed to carry both amusement and challenge. And she said, "Care to try?" Her voice was smooth, yet edged with something dangerous, like a fine blade that caught the light in a quiet room, and the sound of it made the busy bazaar feel suddenly quieter, as if the crowd had moved a step away, though no one had shifted at all. And Eli felt a quick beat of surprise, not just because of what she had said, but because of the way she had said it, like an invitation that meant far more than the words alone. He was not a man who was easily thrown off balance, but there was something in her tone that made his thoughts stumble for a breath. And in that moment, he noticed things he had missed before. The way her clothing was woven with threads that glowed faintly in patterns he did not recognize. The way a small emblem rested just at her collarbone, a shape that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on it, and the way people around them seemed to avoid standing too close, as if they sensed she was not someone to approach lightly. And then it came to him that she might be Valari, a species that until now had only been the subject of rumor in trader circles, whispers about a people who kept to themselves in the deep folds of uncharted space, and were said to be bound by custom so strange that even the few who claimed to have met them could not fully explain. Eli gave a slow smile of his own, masking the flicker of caution that had entered his thoughts, and said, "Depends on what I would be trying," as he shifted slightly to keep her in view, while also noting the movement of a figure in a dark cloak a few rows behind, who seemed to be watching too closely to be a casual shopper. And Lyra, if that was her name, did not look away from him. Instead, she tilted her head a fraction, her eyes bright with something that could have been humor or warning, and replied, "That depends on whether you know the weight of your own words." The bazaar continued its rhythm around them, the smell of roasted grain drifting from a nearby food stall, and the faint hum of translation devices blending with the chatter of merchants. But Eli felt as though the space between them had drawn tight, like a thread pulled to the point of breaking, and he knew instinctively that this meeting was not by chance. Yet he could not say whether she had been waiting for him specifically, or whether she had simply decided that his path and hers would now be bound in some way. He could not yet see, and somewhere in the back of his mind he wondered what exactly Care to try meant in her language, because the way she said it made him think it was no simple flirtation, but a door she had opened, one that might lead to a deal, to a danger, or to something far stranger than either. Eli kept his gaze steady on her eyes while the air between them seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the station itself was holding its breath. And though the crowd pressed around them in waves of shifting voices and movement, he felt as though this moment stood apart from the rest of the bazaar, like a point in space that gravity had decided to hold in place. And he knew the way she had spoken was not casual. The weight of those few words told him that in her world they would carry meaning that went far beyond playful talk. She moved first, turning from the stall with the grace of someone who was not only sure of every step but aware of every pair of eyes that followed her, without needing to glance back. And Eli felt the pull to follow, not just because she was beautiful, but because his instincts told him that walking away now would be the same as walking away from an opportunity that would not come again in a lifetime. So he matched her pace, weaving with her through the rows of traders, past the smell of hot spice steam drifting from food carts, past the glitter of jewelry made from compressed comet ice, past the calls of sellers promising wares from the edges of the Orion Reach. And he noticed again that people seemed to shift out of her way without being asked. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, yet it cut through the noise with a precision that made him focus entirely on the sound. She said, "You speak without knowing yet. You may have already agreed to something you do not understand." And Eli let out a low breath, choosing his reply with care, saying that most of the time the best deals come from agreeing before you know the full weight of the bargain. And he saw her mouth curl faintly, as if she was not sure whether to be amused or impressed. They reached a quieter part of the station, where the roof arched high above them, and the walls were lined with sealed doors, each marked with small glyphs that shifted in the light as though alive. And here the sound of the bazaar faded until the only thing Eli could hear was the low thrum of the station's engines and the measured sound of their own steps. She stopped in front of one door, its frame edged in a faint silver glow, and placed her hand flat against a small panel. The door slid aside without a sound, revealing a narrow passage lit by soft blue lines along the floor inside. The air felt different, warmer, and carrying a faint scent like rain over hot stone, and the walls were smooth metal with strange patterns etched into them. Eli followed her down the passage, wondering if this was her personal space or something even more private. She glanced back once as if to make sure he was still there, and then led him into a chamber where the ceiling opened into a dome, showing a view of the dying blue star that Haven Station orbited. The light painted her skin with shifting colors and made the faint shimmer on her lips even more pronounced, and for a moment he forgot that this was business or diplomacy or whatever strange game they were playing. She said her name then at last, Lyra, the sound of it carrying a rhythm unlike any human language, and explained in measured words that she was an envoy of the Lari people, whose home lay far beyond the mapped routes of human trade. She said the reason she was here was not to buy or sell, but to decide whether humanity was worth speaking to at all. Eli felt the corner of his mouth pull into a smile at that, and asked whether her method of deciding usually began with such personal questions. She gave a faint laugh, like the sound of water over glass, and said that among her kind to comment on the lips is to challenge the one you speak to, and to reply with care. To try is to accept that challenge fully. It is not a flirt. It is an opening of paths. He asked then what lay at the end of that path, and her eyes held his without wavering as she said, an alliance sealed not by words or signatures, but by a ritual. of breath sharing which binds the participants in a trust that cannot be broken without grave cost. It is rare among her people and almost never offered to outsiders, but the Valari faced a danger that had begun to spill into their borders, a warlike empire that would soon find human space as well, and she believed that the only way to stand against it was together. Eli felt the weight of her words settle over him like the pull of deep gravity, because he knew that alliances between species were rarely simple. They carried risk, both political and personal, yet something in him told him this was more than an offer for a treaty. It was an offer to tie his fate to hers, and by extension his people to hers. He asked her what the ritual involved, and she said it was simple, but binding. They would breathe together in a way that mingled life force, a practice that to the Valari was more intimate than any human vow, and that once it was done, there would be no stepping back without both sides paying a price that could not be measured in credits. He was about to speak again when movement at the path side's edge of the dome caught his attention, a shadow slipping against the far curve of the wall, quick and deliberate. He turned slightly without drawing attention to the fact that his hand had moved closer to the knife at his belt, and Lyra's gaze flicked briefly to the same point, telling him she had seen it too. The figure lingered only a moment longer before vanishing into the corridor beyond, and Eli knew without being told that this was no curious passerby. Lyra stepped closer, her voice low enough now that it was almost a breath against his ear, saying that the enemies of her people had followed her here, and that if they saw him with her, then his own life was now tangled in this web, whether he liked it or not. Eli gave a wry half smile and said that in his line of work there were worse fates than being seen in the company of someone like her. But he also knew that whatever happened next, the choice she had laid before him would soon have to be answered, and it would not be a choice he could make lightly. The chamber felt smaller now, as if the dome above them had shifted lower, though Eli knew it was only the weight of the moment pressing down, and the knowledge that somewhere within the vast corridors of Haven Station, a shadow was moving with intent that was not friendly. He stood near Lyra with the faint hum of the station beneath his feet, and the dying blue star casting a soft glow over her face, and for a moment, he could almost forget that they were strangers from different worlds, yet tied together now by chance and by the watchful eyes of someone who wished harm. Lyra walked to the center of the room, her steps slow, and measured, her gaze fixed on the star as she began to speak, not with the guarded tone she had used before, but with something closer to honesty. She told him that the Valari had been at peace for centuries, living in distant space, where the light of foreign suns never touched them, and that they had avoided the noise and greed of younger civilizations, choosing instead to grow in their own way in harmony with the currents of the void. But then the Empire came, its fleets black as obsidian, and armed with weapons that tore through shields as if they were mist. The Valari had fought, but they were not a warlike people, and for every battle they won, they lost 3 more. She said that her people had studied humanity from afar, and what they saw was a species that refused to yield. Even when outmatched, they adapted, they endured. They found ways to win even when the odds broke against them, and so the Council had sent her here to find one human worthy enough to begin a bridge between their worlds, one who would accept the breath sharing, not as a gesture, but as a bond unshakable. Until death, Eli listened in silence, letting her words settle over him. And though part of him wanted to see this as another negotiation, a trade of trust for survival, another part of him understood that what she was offering was heavier than any cargo he had ever carried. He asked her what the ritual would mean for him beyond the political weight, and her eyes met his without wavering, as she said it would mean that their lives would be linked in a way that defied distance and time. They would sense each other in moments of danger. They would feel each other's pain. They would be bound in loyalty before all else, even above their own people. It was why such a bond was rare and sacred for the Valari, because it was not something that could be undone without the destruction of both souls. Eli felt the edge of unease at the thought. Yet there was also a flicker of curiosity, and perhaps something deeper that he did not want to name. The shadow from before had not returned, but he could feel the tension in the air, as if the station itself knew that trouble was coiling close. Lyra seemed to sense it too, because she moved toward a panel in the wall and touched it, the metal shifting away to reveal a narrow stair that led down into the lower decks of the station. She told him they could not remain here, because the attackers would soon guess where she had gone, and the dome's view of the star made it too easy for an assassin to take a clean shot from a distance. Elaine nodded and followed her into the stair, the air growing cooler as they descended, and the sounds of the station changing from the chatter of the bazaar to the deeper hum of machinery. Lower decks were darker, lit only by strips of pale light along the ceiling, and the smell of metal and coolant filled the narrow halls. They moved quickly through the winding corridors, passing workers in grease-stained uniforms, who glanced at them only once before turning away. Eli knew these people had learned long ago that curiosity in these parts could be fatal. Lyra led him to a sealed door and entered a sequence on the panel that made it slide open into a space unlike any other he had seen aboard Haven Station. It was her ship, sleek and silver, with lines that curved like flowing water, and a faint glow that pulsed along its surface, like the heartbeat of some living thing. The interior was just as strange, the walls shimmering with soft colors that shifted when he moved his head, and the air carrying a scent he could not name. She told him this was the Seraphis, a vessel built by the Villari for both speed and silence, and that within its walls they would be safe for now, but the safety would not last unless they acted. Soon Eli asked her why she had chosen him from all the humans she could have met on the station, and she said that when he spoke to her in the bazaar, she heard no fear in his voice and no calculation, only instinct and challenge, and in her culture that was the truest sign of one who could bear the weight of the bond. She told him she had seen others look at her with greed or suspicion, but he had looked at her as if she were simply another player in the game, and that was what her people needed, someone who saw them as equals, not prizes or threats. He considered her words and found that they rang true in a way that made it hard to argue. Before he could answer, a sharp tone rang through the ship, and Lyra's expression hardened. She moved to the control panel and with a few swift motions brought up a display of the station's outer docks. The image showed 3 dark vessels that clung to the edge of the docking ring like carrion birds, their hulls marked with the blood-red insignia of the Empire. She had spoken of. The sight made L.A.'s stomach tighten because he recognized the pattern of those ships from rumors. They were raiders and hunters who left nothing alive behind them. Lyra said they had little time before the Empire's agents boarded the station, and that if they found her before the bond was made, it would not only end her mission but doom any chance of alliance between their people. Eli felt the weight of the choice settle fully on him now, and it was heavier than any cargo. Yet in the silence that followed, he realized that walking away was no longer an option, because he had already stepped too far into her world. The air inside the Seraphis seemed to grow thicker as the shadow of danger wrapped itself tighter around them, and though Eli had faced plenty of tense moments in his life, from haggling with smugglers who kept their blasters under the table to slipping away from debt collectors on pirate moons, this was different, because now the threat was not just aimed at him, but at a woman who carried the trust of her entire people, and at the fragile chance of an alliance that might change the fate of 2 species. Lyra stood before the controls, her hands moving with swift precision over glowing panels that pulsed in rhythm with the hum of the ship, and her voice low but steady, as she said that the Empire's agents would breach the station within minutes, and that once they began sweeping the docks, the Seraphis would be their first target. Ele could feel the thrum of his own pulse in his ears as he glanced toward the small display on the side wall, showing the station's outer corridors, where people were already beginning to scatter as the first warning sirens echoed faintly through the cum lines. The 3 black vessels outside had begun to rotate, slowly bringing their weapon ports into position, and though they had not yet fired, he knew that once they did, the outer docking ring would be torn apart like a tin shell. Lyra turned to him, then her eyes bright with something that was both resolve and an unspoken question, and she told him that if they were to survive this, she would need him to trust her completely, because once the engines engaged, there would be no turning back. Before he could answer, the deck beneath their feet trembled with the distant force of an explosion somewhere. In the station above them, a dull roar that spoke of hull plating giving way, and the sharp hiss of atmosphere venting into space. Lyra moved to the weapons console, her fingers dancing across the alien script, and the sleek hull of the Seraphis responded with a deep rising hum. Eli took position near the access ramp, knowing that if the Empire's agents tried to breach before they could launch, he would have to hold them off long enough for her to break free. The first sign of them came as a flicker of movement in the corridor outside, then the sound of boots striking metal in quick formation. Eli caught sight of 3 figures in black armor, their helmets featureless except for the faint red glow where their eyes should have been. They moved with the precision of predators, their weapons raised and ready. He drew his sidearm and fired a quick burst, the shots sparking against the armor but forcing them back around the corner. Lyra called out that the engines were almost ready, and he shouted back that almost was not good enough as he ducked behind the ramp controls when a burst of plasma seared the air where he had been standing. The second wave came harder, with a small drone sliding into the open space to release a spray of bright energy bolts. Eli rolled aside, pulling a small sphere from his belt and tossing it toward the drone. The flash charge went off with a crack of white light, the machine dropping to the deck in a shower of sparks, but the momentary victory was cut short by the return of the armored soldiers now flanking the entrance. Lyra shouted for him to get inside. He sprinted up the ramp as she sealed it behind him, the ship's hum now building into a steady roar through the forward view. Eli saw the inner dock slip away as the Seraphis lifted from its cradle, turning toward the gap between the docking arms. The station's lights flickered around them as power grids failed under the Empire's assault, and debris drifted through the air from shattered hull plating, but the way out was already closing as one of the black vessels shifted to block their path, its weapons ports glowing with the heat of a charge. Lyra's hands moved faster than he could follow, and the Seraphis surged forward with a sudden burst of speed, twisting on its axis, so that the incoming fire sliced past their hull close enough to make the air in the cabin tremble. The black vessel swung around in pursuit, its larger frame moving like a predator through dark water. Eli could feel the strain in the Seraphis as Lyra pushed it harder, weaving through the outer docking ring and into open space, but the enemy's weapons were already flashing in the distance, long beams of crimson energy slicing across the void, one of them clipping the rear shields and sending a shudder through the cabin. Alarms flared in a language Eli could not read, but the tone told him enough: the shields were failing. Lyra glanced at him, then her voice calm but urgent as she said that if the ritual was to be done, it had to be now, because once the shields collapsed, nothing would protect. The melee stared at her for a long moment, hearing the thrum of the engines and the rising pitch of the alarms, and feeling the pull of the decision. He had been circling since they met. He thought of the danger ahead and the bond she had described, one that would tie his life to hers in a way no contract could undo. And though every instinct told him to weigh the risks, he found himself stepping toward her without hesitation. Lyra reached up, touching a control that dimmed the lights and brought a faint glow to the air between them, a shimmer like the reflection of starlight on still water. She told him to breathe with her, to match her rhythm, to let the space between them vanish and the life within them merge. The first breath was strange, carrying a faint taste of metal and something sweet. The second brought a warmth into his chest that was not his own. The third made the hum of the ship fade from his hearing until the only sound was the quiet pulse of her breath and his together. He felt a current pass through him, not physical, but something deeper that brushed against memories and thoughts and then settled in the space just behind his heartbeat. a presence that was both separate and part of him. Lyra's eyes never left his, and he could see that she felt it too. The ship lurched violently, snapping the moment back to the edge of reality as a crimson beam tore past their bow. Lyra turned back to the controls, but now Eli felt a strange certainty that he knew her intentions. Before she moved the ship rolling hard to the right into a blind escape path that moments ago, he would have thought impossible. The bond was real, and with it came the unshakable sense that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The Seraphis moved like a living arrow through the void, weaving between streams of crimson fire as the enemy ships closed in, their dark hulls glinting under the fading light of the dying star. And inside the cabin, Ele felt every shift in the vessel as if the bond with Lyra had turned the pulse of the ship into his own heartbeat. They did not need to speak to know what the other was thinking, the rhythm of their breaths still moving together and guiding their actions as one. The bond had made their connection sharper and faster than any crew training could have done, and though the black vessels were faster on open engines, the Seraphis danced around them with a precision that turned near hits into glancing strikes. Lyra's hand swept across the controls, sending the ship into a sudden dive that carried them dangerously close to the shattered edges of the outer ring of the station, debris tumbling past like jagged teeth. Eli took the gunnery controls without her asking, the targeting reticle locking onto the lead vessel as it came around for another pass. The moment it opened its ports, he fired a concentrated burst of plasma, the rounds slamming into the weapons array and bursting into a flare of molten shards. The vessel reeled sideways, its fire breaking off and opening a narrow corridor of escape. They surged forward, but the second enemy ship cut in from above, its shadow falling over the Seraphis like a hunting bird, and Eli felt the change in Lyra's thoughts through the bond, the understanding that the only way to break free was to take a risk that would leave them inches from destruction. He braced himself as she angled the ship sharply upward, the inertial pull pressing them into their seats until it felt like their bones would bend. The Seraphis shot past the underbelly of the enemy ship, so close that Eli could see the details of its armor plates. Then Lyra twisted the controls, sending a pulse from the Seraphis' ventral cannons directly into its engine core. Blast tore through the black hull with a violent bloom of light that scattered molten fragments into the void. The victory was brief because the third vessel had locked onto their position and fired a volley of beams that forced Lyra to swerve hard into the shadow of the station's remains. Eli felt the ship shudder as fragments scraped along the outer plating, the shields struggling to hold together. He could sense Lyra's focus narrowing, every motion of her hands driven by a mix of skill and an instinct that felt as if it now belonged to them. Both the enemy vessel drew closer, its weapons charging for what would be a killing strike, and Eli knew that if they could not outmaneuver this one, then the fight would end here. Through the bond, he caught a flicker of her plan before she moved the Seraphis, darting toward the outer edge of the dying star's light, where the corona burned with unstable energy streams. The enemy followed close, confident that their heavier armor could withstand whatever the edge of the star threw at them. Lyra whispered for him to hold steady and then plunged the Seraphis directly into the glare, the heat shields flaring white, the sensors screaming warnings. Eli could barely see through the blaze, but he felt the shift as Lyra banked suddenly hard to the right, dragging the enemy into the full path of a rising solar surge. The flare struck the black vessel with a burst of raw energy, tearing across its hull and sending it spinning helplessly into the void, trailing a bright wake of molten metal. The space ahead was clear at last, and the Seraphis streaked away from the chaos, leaving the station behind as the last echoes of the battle faded into the darkness. Ele leaned back in his seat, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding through the fight, but the warmth of the bond still steady within him. Lyra slowed the ship, bringing it into the calm stretch of space between the station and the distant shadow of the Valari roots. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before softening into a smile that carried the same spark as when they had first spoken in the bazaar. Only now there was something more beneath it, the weight of shared survival and unspoken trust. She told him that by completing the breath sharing, he had not only tied his fate to hers, but had tied humanity to the Valari, and that what they had done today would be remembered by her people as the first act of the alliance. He asked her what came next, and she said that they would travel to the Valari homeworld to speak before the council, and that there they would decide how to stand together against the Empire. Eli felt the thoughts settle in. His mind like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of possibility spreading outward, because he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as strangers but as two bound by a vow deeper than any written pact. The hum of the Sarathas was steady, now its heartbeat matching his own, and for the first time since they had met, there was no rush in their movements, no threat pressing against their backs. Lyra leaned back in her seat, glancing at him with that same curve to her lips, and she said again, in a quieter voice, care to try the words now, carrying not just the challenge from before, but a promise of the journey ahead. And Eli found himself smiling without hesitation, because he knew the answer had already been given when he chose to breathe with her. In the heart of danger, and in that shared silence, the stars stretched before them endless and waiting for whatever they would make of them together. The end.